Okay, hello. You're listening to Angelneers, the podcast. Angelneers is a Silicon Valley community for startup builders where founders and operators share their firsthand knowledge on how to build and scale startups. I'm your host, Oleg Kujikov, and our guest today is Raj Singh, CEO and co-founder of Pulse, a startup that's building a better way for distributed teams to connect, communicate, and collaborate. Most recently, Raj co-founded Tempo AI, which was acquired by Salesforce. He also co-founded All the Cooks, which was acquired by CookPad, and was the founding BD person at Skyfire, which was acquired by Opera. So good track record of acquisitions there. In the last 2 decades, Raj has been involved with numerous startups as a consultant, advisor, and investor. He's also been running a blog writing about mostly his tech thoughts. Today, we're talking with Raj about bringing better communication to remote working. But before we get into that, Raj, thank you for taking the time out of all of these jobs that you do and joining us on the show.
Yes, thanks for the opportunity. And you're the first person who's actually basically read my bio.
So, the bio's good, but that's just what we glean from the internet. Tell us about yourself, from you. How did you get started in this business?
So as you said, focused on remote work tools. I had a partially distributed team before it was popular. So this is my last company, which you had mentioned, Tempo AI, that was acquired by Salesforce. And we had set up a, let's call it, somewhat popular, somewhat unpopular sort of company culture. So we used to ship a second device to everybody we would hire, which could be based in different remote cities or whatnot. And at the office, or those that were at the office, we would perch a laptop. And we'd ask everyone to kind of join this 24-hour, always running video hangout. And it was very effective for us. Obviously, when we hired new team members, some maybe didn't prefer that kind of setup, but once they got kind of accustomed to it, they actually found it to be really neat because you can hear and see everything that was going on, and you sort of felt connected to your team. After we had been acquired by Salesforce, they didn't really have a remote sort of first culture at the time, and this was back in 2015, 2016. And so they started flying in a lot of our remote colleagues to the office on some regular cadence, and it was it was work. But what was interesting was a lot of those colleagues, and especially after I'd left Salesforce and I'd reconnect with them, would basically say that they felt disconnected from the mothership unless they did come back and visit the office on some super regular cadence. And so I thought a lot about that problem. I'd taken some time off as well after I'd left Salesforce, but thought a lot about that problem. And so really was thinking about, well, how can I solve this sense of connectedness, or how can I make distributed teams feel more connected? And arrived at a series of ideas, initially it being a virtual office, but ultimately landed at what you're seeing now, which is Pulse, which is very much about sharing increased presence and status, but in a way that you feel like you're in more control with your distributed team through Slack. And we have found that teams using basically automatic status for Slack are feeling more connected and are feeling like they're in better control of their day from the perspective of fewer interruptions and more opportunity where they choose to ad hoc and collaborate.
So, Raj, I think you mentioned a term. Was it remote worker tools? Is that what you said you worked in? How long have you been working with remote tools? And just talk about that generally as an industry that's growing.
So I would say when we had our distributed team circa 2011, 2012, and certainly many people have had some facet of a remote team, maybe an offshore team, maybe a team at co-located offices, whatever it might be. I would say when I think about remote, I'm thinking about individuals working from home full time. So this is like 2011, 2012. It was a relatively nascent category from a tools perspective. There was certainly a class of companies that were distributed. Fully distributed was a very rare breed. Mostly it was partially distributed. And it was not necessarily with the motivation to build a distributed team for the sake of building a distributed team. It was often driven because it was difficult to just find talent. And so great talent was everywhere. And as a startup, I hate to say it, more affordable talent. And so hiring purely, Bay Area, Silicon Valley can be difficult. And so you wanted to be open-minded and look outside of the Bay Area and consider applicants from different parts of the country and whatnot, or the world. And so many of the tools that were available at the time that were kind of looking at distributed teams, again, as I said, relatively nascent. There was things around always-on video tools. So there's a company called Perch that tried to sort of facilitate that, like a variation of sort of running an always-on Google Hangout, but very different if you look at sort of that time period to post-COVID, where we've now seen just a surge of new tools that have been created to help improve sort of distributed work culture, productivity, collaboration, help better address burnout, all the sort of different pain points that colleagues and those that have been working from home have been reporting.
Right. Yeah, I'm sure, having been in the remote work setting for almost 2 years now, some of us are starting to get more familiar with distributed work tools. It sounds like you've been thinking about these kind of problems for a while, though, and I know you founded Loop, which has recently pivoted to Pulse now. Can you talk about what was the idea for Loop, and then why did you decide to pivot?
Yeah, so our approach in sort of solving this remote connectedness sort of issue was to build what we call a virtual office, which is certainly now a category, and you can take a look. And basically, if you look at a virtual office, and probably some of the most visible examples are, you'll see these large 2D maps, and you kind of move your spatial character around the map. And when you're within the spatial bubble of another person, you can start talking. And so it's to sort of taking a physical office and bringing it online into a digital kind of form factor. What we found with the Loop Team Virtual Office, which, by the way, was used by hundreds of teams, was that as these teams grew to 20, 25, 30, 35, 40 people, whatnot, we were experiencing churn. And obviously that's a problem. Why are these teams churning? And what we found was our audio video quality was just simply not to snuff. We know that's a hard problem. Zoom, Microsoft Teams, Google Meet, they've spent literally billions in sort of building that infrastructure. And so we tried to make improvements there, but that proved to be a very challenging sort of thing. But the other thing that we found was a lot of the presence, which we surfaced not in a visual of a map, but rather in the form of status. So it'd say things like in a document right now, or messaging, or in focus, or whatever it might be, was proving to be very delightful. And a number of users had asked us, like, hey, can you bring this to Slack? And so what we realized was, well, let's focus on that. Let's focus on what's working, from the perspective of like a old startup idiom. And so we made the decision earlier this year to double down on status and presence, and that's how we sort of landed at Pulse, and kind of got ourselves out of the communication side of the virtual office. And so what we've done is we've basically brought automatic status to Slack. And it really changes the experience. Slack, the green dot hasn't evolved in 20 years, since the days of ICQ and Skype and whatnot. And we make it more contextual, we make it more rich. And it results in net positive pretty much all around, from reduced interruptions to feeling more connected to simply having more control. Some people just get anxiety when they're not being seen as online all the time. And that's something that you can configure Pulse in such a way to help also address.
Interesting. So what are automatic statuses? Because Slack has the option to do regular statuses, right? I could set it myself, but what's automatic about it? Yeah.
So if you think of status today, it's usually just sort of a green dot, you're online, or you're possibly idle, depending on the messaging client you're using. So when people think of their virtual office, by the way, they're usually thinking of Slack or Teams or something, one of those sort of tools, or they're offline. So there's really kind of three states. It's kind of online, offline, maybe idle. And your last option is you can go and set something custom. If you think about the layers of automatic status, the first step is just sort of like my calendar. Let people know when I'm in a meeting. Now, when you were all physically working in an office, we could all see each other. So if you looked over your shoulder, if you peeked down the hallway, whatever it might be, you can kind of see when somebody was in a meeting, somebody's occupied, somebody has their headsets on, somebody's focused, somebody's designing right now, somebody just got up and it's around noon, so I'm probably going to guess they're probably heading to lunch. There's a lot of inference that happens. We internally often describe that as your presence is your status. You being there in the office is a status, and you're kind of just as you walk around, you're statusing all the time. But when you're distributed, all of that is lost. And so what we're really doing is we're taking all of that and we're representing it ultimately in the form of an emoji that automatically sort of updates throughout the day and reflects an automatic status. So it could be something like focused, if we think you're in focused right now, and that could change the sender's behavior. Maybe somebody wants to send you a message and say, you know what, I don't want to interrupt right now. It could say something like, has a really busy afternoon this evening or later today. It could be on vacation the rest of the week, could be holiday in their country. You name it. There's a whole range of different sort of permutations, literally thousands, based on hundreds of data sources that we've plugged into that helps not only give you a better sense of is the person available right now? Is he or she, is it a good time to connect? But also creates opportunity for collaboration. It could say something like designing in this file right now because they choose to configure it in such a way to share that information. And so you're like, oh, now's a good time to talk to that person because we're working on the same thing. To also being a way to sort of communicate empathy, recognizing that, oh, maybe somebody's jet lagged because they traveled yesterday, or recognizing that it's really late for them because I didn't realize their time zone, which this user chose to share automatically through their status.
Got it. Yeah. So it seems like it has a lot of benefits, or it could do a lot of great things for your office, your remote work culture. Long term, can you talk about like what the vision is for Pulse?
Yeah. So if you think about status and sort of the green dot, pretty much across a variety of applications, status exists all over the place. You go inside even your workplace tools like Jira, there's a green dot to indicate you're online. You're in Google Docs. It shows your little avatar and it highlights you when you're actually in the doc, but when you're not in the doc, it grayscales you. And so there is this sort of lightweight form of status all over the place. But for the most part, it's been very stagnant. And so we really think of status and presence as a layer that we can own and sort of create this sort of meta layer of remote work, for lack of a better term. And so I think right now we're obviously servicing and bringing that into Slack. We'll soon bring it into Teams. And other sort of workplace chat communication products. But we really want to take it from that to bringing it everywhere. So imagine you're on your phone, and before you send that iMessage or call your friend, it says to you that so-and-so's on a phone call right now, or so-and-so's in a meeting, or so-and-so's focused. It may change your behavior. You may decide, oh, you know what, I don't want to ping right now. Maybe I'll ping later, whatever it might be. And so creating that sort of status layer across everything is really where we want to go. And to help facilitate that, what we have done is, in addition to bringing automatic status into Slack, we have also opened up a developer interface so you can plug in data into Pulse, but you can also subscribe to Pulse status if you want to bring rich contextual status into your own application.
So it's really interesting to talk about this, 2 years into a pandemic that's, kind of largely pushed us towards this digital world that, existed, but it wasn't, it didn't have to support everything that it does when we're all on it. So we're kind of learning new ways to kind of live in this digital world. Let's take a step back from what your solution is and look at kind of like the pain points and the customer needs here. What are some kind of like common issues and complaints that are kind of the reason for having something like this?
So I think if you look at a lot of the surveys that have come out of remote work over the last 2 years, they've been remarkably consistent. Sort of employees, workforce have been reporting Zoom notification fatigue, or Zoom fatigue, as well as notification fatigue, interruptions, a lack of focus time, a sense of feeling loneliness. They're working from home alone or whatnot, feeling disconnected, particularly from other groups and other teams. And so there has been this real effort over the last couple of years on how we can better recreate that feeling of working side by side. Now, certainly, obviously, a big part of a great remote work distributed team culture is being able to get work done and have tools in place to do asynchronous communication as well. And certainly that's happening. But there is substantive work that happens every day in a hyper collaborative kind of way, where you do kind of need to work side by side. And right now, it's more, there aren't, the best way to sort of address that is what you're finding people do is set up basically always running Zooms or whatnot. And so this was a way we felt that we could help improve upon each of those sort of top pain points, whether it be interruptions, we definitely reduce those, increasing more opportunity for ad hoc or serendipitous communication, feeling less lonely and so forth.
So there's certainly pain points, and I could see why this could impact your workforce's productivity and maybe their morale. Do you have any idea how it might impact productivity and morale? Those types of things, like it's certainly not great for it, but can you kind of quantify like why that's not good for your organization?
I think what I can say is it's the types of things that have been coming from remote work surveys have alarmed a number of folks within people operations, HR departments across a range of Fortune 500 companies. You are seeing burnout continuing to rank as one of the highest issues within a lot of these organizations. And there is a lot of research and data supporting that the lack of sort of in-person collaboration is having an adverse impact on innovation. And so there is a lot of hypotheses around sort of needing to create more ad hoc serendipitous communication versus scheduled meeting sort of driven culture. And so I think a lot of these workplace resources, human resources, people operations sort of departments are taking this quite seriously and thinking through adjustments they can make through tooling as well as workplace culture. And that's why you do see a number of actions that have been taken over the last year from a range of companies. They've introduced new tools like digital whiteboard tools that have emerged. Some of them have adopted virtual office tools, like these large 2D map sort of experiences. Some of them have adopted specific meeting culture rules, like no Zoom meetings on X and Y day, or come back to the office these days and we're going to have X hours to just sort of serendipitously ad hoc brainstorm, whatever it might be. So you are seeing a range of these different things. Certainly a lot of these efforts are experiments in their own right. It's very hard to quantify, but you can definitely see an end result if you're churning employees at a faster rate than you were before, or if your internal surveys are indicating that more and more employees want to leave in the next year, which is true in many of these sort of organizations. And so efforts to help sort of combat that or to help improve upon that are very welcomed.
And is there like a pain point you are focusing on the most between the ones we've mentioned already?
I think focus time and collaboration. I mean, those are the two things that I think when you think about what you really miss when you're in an office. Obviously, you miss seeing your colleagues and maybe being able to chat and communicate with people that you don't normally work with on a day-to-day basis. So that's sort of serendipitous or just non-work chat, which doesn't happen if everything is schedule driven. And so we certainly are looking at like, well, through automatic status, we can better indicate when somebody's in focus, and it would say in their status focused. And so that gives them more opportunity to sort of focus and get work done and not be interrupted. And I think on the other side of that coin, creating more opportunity to say, hey, let's chat now, which I otherwise probably would have pinged you at the wrong time because I didn't realize or didn't have the context that maybe you had already looked at this particular document that we need to discuss or currently looking at it right now. And so this creates a good opportunity to collaborate. What I think the key thing to keep in mind and think about is these are behaviors that happen when you're in the office. So when you're in the office and you're in your little corner part of the office with the colleagues that you work with most closely, when you had a question about a particular design item or development item or whatever it might be, accounting, you kind of look over and you're like, oh, colleague is focused right now or engaged in another conversation, not a good time to interrupt. I'll try to catch them later. Then later in the day, you look over and like, oh, they're in the file right now that I need to talk about. Let me interrupt them now. Now's a good time. And so I think that those sort of social cues, they happen in the office, but when you're distributed, you lose all of that. And so it very much has become very calendar driven, schedule driven sort of culture. And that's what's triggering some of the feedback that we're seeing that's coming through reporting and surveys and whatnot in terms of how distributed has impacted their team.
You make good points. It makes a lot of sense. Once we move to distributed work, what happens? Well, everyone's distributed. You lose some of the things you get just like from human connection in an office. So we kind of have to recreate some of that. What kind of key assumptions have you made as you built the design and functionality of your service? Like, let me give you an example. Like, distributed work is here to stay might be a key assumption.
Yeah, I think you kind of called one out already. Whether it's distributed or hybrid, that's definitely here to stay. I think there was some doubt maybe last year in winter, spring. But at this point, it's very clear that this is going to be the future of work for a number of industries, not for all industries, but for a number of industries. And very clear that in a number of industries, more and more can be done remotely, not necessarily necessitating sort of meeting in person or whatever it might be, as it may have in the past. I think we certainly make assumptions around just sort of like this innate need for human interaction and ad hoc communication or serendipitous communication. And I think that is something a lot of companies are thinking through right now with, well, let's do hybrid, but let's make more opportunity for people to just sort of connect on an interpersonal level as opposed to a work level. And so how can you create more opportunity for collaboration from that sort of perspective? But a lot of that is also how do you deliver more empathy? So imagine your status is not just like an expression of availability, but it's an expression of interest. Like, so-and-so attended his baseball game yesterday, or so-and-so's on his Peloton and crushed it today. And those are all things that we could infer through automatic status. And so it's a way to communicate empathy, which creates opportunity to kind of break out of that sort of day-to-day work cycle and have a more interpersonal, serendipitous discussion while remote. So, I mean, I think that's sort of innate need. I don't think of distributed teams as sort of robots in a manufacturing plant where there's almost no communication, right? And there's just like a supply chain and everyone's kind of moving down this sort of a carrier line or whatnot. So that's certainly an assumption. I mean, I guess I sort of think about. I do think these workplace messaging tools are a necessity. There's been a lot of discussion around asynchronous culture sort of being the future of work. Matt Mullenweg's kind of like triangle and the 5 levels, and level 5 being true async and not needing any synchronous discussion. I don't subscribe to that thesis. So I certainly am in the bucket that hyper collaborative, synchronous work culture, portions of that will continue to exist, won't go away. And we're certainly seeing that amongst the vast majority of remote work companies, or companies that are operating in any sort of remote or hybrid kind of capacity. Still thinking through your question, other sort of assumptions that we've made, but I guess you kind of called out the sort of key assumption that distributed hybrid work is here to stay.
Well, yeah, sorry, I took the good one. Tell us next about the origin story. We already kind of talked about it briefly in the intro, but tell us about. Well, what do you consider your origin? Is it the pivot to Pulse, or is it when you started Loop? Take us through your origin story.
I consider the origin my experiences, as I mentioned earlier, when I was at Salesforce. The need of having to fly to an office on some regular cadence to feel connected feels unnecessary. And so how can you better solve that to make team members feel more connected? And if you look at Slack on its own, certainly you're going to see a bunch of notifications pop up for a variety of channels, but otherwise you really have no idea who's available, who's around, what people are up to, particularly outside of your core team, those that you don't interact with. And it actually can feel quite lonely. You don't really see anything. You just see a bunch of green dots. So, my origin came from my experience in Salesforce and looking at some of those remote work challenges and then really then just studying the range of different sort of approaches and solutions that companies and teams have taken to try to solve such, many of which were mostly focused around video and always on video or asynchronous video. But I realized in talking to a lot of companies, and we learned this through Loop Team, a lot of folks think of their core sort of messaging app as their office. When people think about, is John around? They jump into Slack or they jump into Microsoft Teams or Google Chat and they see if John's online. And that indicates John is around. But they don't really know anything beyond that. They may not know that John's super jet lagged, started his day at 3 a.m. today, and not a great time to drop in and ask a bunch of questions and throw on some complicated stuff or whatever it might be. Or they don't know that John's like deeply coding right now and super in focus and not a good time to interrupt. And so that's kind of, it was really sort of starting with that. And then obviously with Loop Team, we tested a lot of those hypotheses and we built a product that hundreds of teams were using, but we struggled on the communication side of it, which was a little bit out of our control because we didn't build the video conferencing stuff ourselves. And frankly, that's a whole nother can of worms, which Zoom and Microsoft Teams and others do really, really well. And so recognition in that process that, hey, we can just focus on status and presence and drop the communications aspect is how we landed at Pulse. And now we're sort of onboarding paid teams.
It's got to be kind of a leap of faith too, right? Big on your part to sort of say this communications aspect, this part of the business is difficult. What's the result been like so far, pivoting and sort of dropping that aspect of the business?
There's always a leap of faith, and I think a number of companies fail when you do that. Change in direction is the term I'd like to use. I wouldn't necessarily call it pivot because I don't think it's like a hard right. We're really just we're doubling down on a portion of what we had built with Loop Team. I think the challenges in that sort of change in direction are less so with the execution. I mean, there's certainly the execution, and usually it's driven off some insights that you've gained from operating whatever you were building before. The challenge is often just managing the team and sort of moving the team from a morale perspective and into a new change in direction and what we already built and whatnot. And so it takes time. It's like, I think a good analogy here is it's like steering a ship, and the larger your ship, the harder it is to steer, or the longer it takes to steer. But I think we kind of started this journey back in March, and now we're live and we're onboarding paying teams and just sort of getting started. So from that perspective, it's really neat. And I guess the other side of it is it's not as much as a leap of faith. It's based on the learnings of running a virtual office with hundreds of active teams. So a lot of that data and the insight that we gleaned from there and how people were using it and the feedback that we were getting is all sort of being channeled into Pulse.
Tell us about the people behind Pulse. Who have you brought in to make sure that you have the best odds you can possibly have?
Well, we have a good investor group, a number of sort of well-known, seed institutional funds, and then my co-founders are both former entrepreneurs. They both have had either their own startups that have exited or been part of startups that have exited, and then we have a team of a number of folks that we worked with before and or knew through common friends or whatnot that we've sort of built, and we've grown together through the journey. So it's I think it's it doesn't take a ton of people to build great software, but it certainly takes the right people to sort of work well together. And so I feel lucky from that sort of perspective.
How about hiring? How do you attract the best talent?
I think hiring, everyone's having challenges with hiring. I think one of the things that remote work has done, and being more open-minded about remote work, and we were always in this mindset anyways, is that it is a global talent pool, and there are people you can recruit from anywhere in the world. And so I think that certainly has helped. At the end of the day, I feel like when somebody decides where they choose to work, it's do they like the people, and do they think the problems are interesting? Do they think this is a place they want to spend the next year or two to sort of learn and grow? And so I think from that perspective, we have a unique interview process that we kind of go through that makes it more entertaining or challenging. And I think that process and connection, which is sort of meeting the team and the stage and whatnot, hopefully creates an opportunity that's interesting to many, but at the same time recognize that there's also large companies that can just throw lots and lots of money at the problem, which is certainly going to attract a different category of folks. We don't necessarily try to compete with that category, but we're not necessarily trying to hire those people. People are purely in it to try to sort of maximize income.
Got it. Well, now let's take a look under the hood. Can you talk about your technology stack and maybe what kind of important choices you had to make early on?
We're like most companies. We're built on top of AWS. We use a lot of off-the-shelf AWS stuff. I think early on when we were doing conferencing, there were certainly some key decisions around what conferencing provider to use. There's a number of them. There's even more available today, and fewer in some ways. Some of them no longer exist. But that sort of no longer applies. I think the Pulse experience, we certainly had to choose which platform we wanted to go with first, and we chose Slack. That was kind of very, very sort of good developer program and very, very comprehensive. And so it's a great place to sort of start, but certainly want to bring it to Teams and Google and elsewhere soon. But then I think the other sort of decision was, the Pulse experience runs on your desktop. Should that be built as a native experience or a framework called Electron, which is what we lean upon, which allows us to effectively write once and run anywhere. So we can run it both on Windows and Mac very quickly. And so that was a decision we made, which I think was the right decision. It has some trade-offs, but there haven't been a huge number of sort of platform stack sort of related questions. I mean, there's obviously always questions around what should be used for support, what should be used for our blog, what should be used for mailing, what should be used for analytics, and so forth. But fortunately, there's quite a few particularly early on, tried, true, tested tools out there that you can lean on to make that all sort of work. And then obviously as you scale and grow, you can then start exploring whether you want to switch out to something more comprehensive or can enable other sort of things that you need.
How do you use AI to reproduce the office experience? Are you using AI?
Yeah, so we use AI in a few different places. So one of the things that we do is we have like at desk detection. So your status could say you're at your desk if you want to share that. So if you got up and walked over to a conference room, it would say you're not at your desk. And so that uses a little bit of guesswork using Wi-Fi triangulation to kind of figure that out. We also try to figure out if we think you're in focus. It sounds like an easy problem, but it's not. You might be watching a YouTube video, you have no mouse or keyboard activity, but you're actually in focus and don't want to be interrupted right now because maybe you're watching a webinar or a training video or something like that. Or maybe you're typing away in a document and you're like deep in thought and you really don't want to be interrupted right now. It is interesting if you look at sort of psychology research around focus time and the time it takes to sort of interfocus and exit focus versus how our system sort of perceives focus. We see focus as snippets, so somebody might be in deep focus for the last 3 minutes and then kind of drop out of focus. And, the brain does sort of ADD task switch like every 10 or 15 seconds. It's been coming down over time. So it is interesting kind of looking at that data and what is the optimal time. When you think about people who manually try to manage their focus, they sometimes would go into their calendar and put a block, just say focus time for like an hour. What they're basically saying is just don't interrupt me during that hour. But it's interesting because the brain really doesn't work like that. Like you actually are task switching all the time. You might be typing, but then you might be looking at something else. So trying to understand and figure that out and personalize that to different people, and that in itself is a very, very sort of interesting AI problem.
Definitely. Yeah. My own experience is very like hit or miss. Like the block of focus time really doesn't work for me. What works is kind of like actually making the time for the thing I want to do, not just kind of putting a general time to focus. But it's different for different people, right? That focus block might work great for some folks. So that's a really exciting challenge. Talk about some of the key milestones that you've achieved to this point.
I think this last 6-7 months has really been about executing this sort of change in direction. So recognizing last year in early spring timeframe that, hey, we're churning teams when they get to 25, 30, 40 people in size. And so a lot of it is a number of sort of smaller milestones, which is sort of getting the team to believe in the change in direction, start building towards the new change in direction, which is what is now Pulse, getting it named, launching it, bringing it live with paying customers, sort of end of lifing the previous product. There's a lot of things that are involved in that sort of process. And I think a lot of people take that process for granted. It's certainly easier to do when you're 2-3 person team, pre-funded, whatnot. But I think once you're post-seed round and building, it's a completely different game. And so I think when I think about milestones over the last year, I am proud of what we've done in sort of executing that change in direction and landing where we are.
Okay, next let's talk customer experience. Can you talk about who your primary users are and how much effort is involved in setting up Pulse? Yeah,
so I mean, we only brought Pulse live during the week of Thanksgiving. So it's only been out in market for a couple weeks now. We started onboarding. We're in the process of sunsetting our previous virtual office product. So we started onboarding some teams from Loop Team, which is our virtual office product. And so it's been interesting. I mean, certainly there's individuals who identify the problem. Oftentimes it's managers because they feel like their team needs better visibility, communication, collaboration, whatever it might be. And so that's been really neat. But the use cases are various in a very Notion kind of way. I think Notion early had published some philosophy that they wanted to make the tool very customizable. We see a similar kind of experience. We'll see a head of sales want to share Salesforce activity into status on Slack. We'll see an engineering manager more focused around availability and focus time. We'll see an HR manager more interested in sharing PTO and vacation schedules. So really interesting seeing different ways that people are using it depending on their job function, but also the different types of things that people want to share into status.
And then how about your go-to-market? How do you get in front of customers?
Yeah, so one of the neat things about status is it's very viral. You kind of see somebody's status in Slack and you kind of peek over it and hover and see what it says. And so that creates this interesting loop inside an organization where people can quickly discover, like, oh, what is that? Let me check that out. So that's sort of really neat. I think the other sort of obvious channels is to make Pulse work, we integrate with a lot of data sources, and each of those data sources, whether it be Jira, Trello, Google Calendar, Office 365, whatever it might be, are channels for us. Each of them have app stores. They are incentivized to kind of promote Pulse because it's actually an opportunity to sort of show their brand inside Slack or Microsoft Teams as a way to then drive more virality to other types of users who may not be using their product. So, for example, if you're Uber Conference, somebody can see you're on an Uber Conference call, and another user who doesn't use Uber Conference will be like, oh, maybe I should go try that out. So that creates a nice synergy with the different sort of companies that we integrate with to bring in sort of data to push into status. And so that's also, so that's a really neat sort of go-to-market channel, just sort of the different kind of data providers of status. And then I think, there's a lot of communities that are built around a lot of these tools like Jira and whatnot that are really focused on workflows. And these communities exist on Notion or Reddit or whatnot. And those are all also great channels for us to sort of drive adoption because we're bringing things that they might be sharing into some other sort of view, but directly into the user status, which can then trigger another workflow. So I think from those sort of non-obvious paths, those are great sort of go-to-market channels. Of course, there's the more obvious, which is sort of direct marketing and reaching out to teams or organizations that could benefit from this, as well as paid acquisition and those sort of more obvious channels, content marketing, whatnot. But I think the ones I aforementioned, those are certainly neat sort of advantages that we get just because of the nature of our product.
Think about that kind of nuance, but that is an interesting advantage. You mentioned kind of being able to go into partner apps, or not partner app stores, but certain app stores. Can you talk about have you managed to build any partnerships, and do you have any examples you'd like to mention?
We've done integrations with some big companies already, companies like Atlassian for Jira and Trello, so you can bring their data into Slack status, Google Drive. We have a number in our roadmap from Asana to Spotify to Strava, all sorts of interesting information that you may want to share into status. And so I think it's neat because there's both consumer and business applications in terms of things that you might want to share into status. It could even be PTO schedules, like vacation schedules from ADP. It could be deeper activity from Salesforce or whatever it might be. So I think there's kind of a range, and we're obviously working through that list, but those are some of the examples of things that we've integrated so far.
All right, let's talk about some other startup-related activities that you're involved with. We'll start with kind of your work with startups. You work a lot with other startups. Do those kind of opportunities come your way? Are they inbound, or are you sourcing those?
Obviously, I'm pretty much 100% focused on Pulse. This is my sort of bread and butter. I think if you're perusing at my LinkedIn, you'll see that I've invested in a range of things. Those are mostly into other funds. I don't have time to. I don't do any direct investing, if that's what you're asking. So those other funds do all the work. I'm just an investor in some of those funds. I am obviously, I blog a little bit, although I haven't been terribly active recently, and I certainly am an advisor to a couple companies, but those are far and few between. I think it's important to focus, so I don't try to stretch myself too thin. But if you're thinking about 20-year curve, yes, I've been doing startups for a long time. I dropped out of master's to start my first company when it was certainly not in vogue and nobody really knew what a startup was. This is back in 2000. But it's an area I feel very comfortable in, I guess, with the unknown or the unknown future. But I really enjoy it because I feel like it stresses you in a positive way, in the sense that it really sort of pushes you to kind of keep learning, keep you on your toes, think out of the box, and so forth.
You mentioned your blog. Can you talk, what do you write about?
So previously I used to blog at other channels. I used to blog, I used to be the mobile blogger for O'Reilly, which is that famous book publisher company. They made a bunch of these development books with little animals on the cover. Yeah. And then later I used to guest blog at Mobile Crunch, which used to be a TechCrunch mobile dedicated website, Mobile Beat, which used to be a VentureBeat mobole dedicated website, and a number of other places. And then later at my own LinkedIn and my own website, which I barely maintain. I don't write about, I'm going to be honest, I've been heads down and focused, so I haven't been writing as much as I should be. Typically, I think and selfishly, usually writing about the industry that I'm working in. When I'm between companies or between startups in that downtime, then I take a more open-minded approach and write about other sorts of topics. But certainly in recent years, mostly been writing about future of remote work productivity, remote work teams, distributed team culture, those sorts of topics.
Do you feel like you have a good work-life balance with that? Considerate with like what you just mentioned.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, I have kids, and so it's really about creating boundaries and prioritizing. And so I think I do have a good. I kind of know, where I need to sort of disconnect and reconnect, and I think that's necessary. Otherwise, you will get burned out. I mean, certainly, I may not be on a computer, but I'm often thinking about work, and so it takes a little bit of effort to be able to mentally disconnect. I think I think work life is not as separated as people think it is. I think it's very blended in certain kinds of roles, like in my role, and so I might be doing work stuff on the weekend. I might be doing personal stuff during the week. It's kind of each day it's a mix.
What's one thing about Pulse that makes you stand out from the crowd?
Yeah, so right now, if you look at status in Slack or other sort of messaging apps, usually at best people just connect their calendar, and so that's the best you have. We actually have not seen folks take a sort of global or heterogeneous kind of holistic approach to all of the sort of different types of data. I think part of the innovation or key idea here was the fact that status is more than just simply a green dot, the fact that it actually can be used as a medium to communicate. And so I think that puts us in some very green space. There isn't a lot that currently looks similar. There are behaviors that certainly look similar. So those that operate in, let's say, Discord world, not uncommon. People will install apps to share what game they're currently playing in, or whether they're in Netflix or YouTube or whatever they are at any given point in time, sort of activity being shared as status. And you're seeing that on the consumer front, but you haven't really seen an effort to try to bring that into the workplace and on the work front, and in a way where the user feels like they're in more control, to then foster and spin up more collaboration and reduce interruption and so forth. So I think it's early innings. Certainly Slack, Microsoft Teams, Google Workspace themselves are thinking how they can improve the experience in and around status, and they've been thinking about it for a long time. And I suspect they will make improvements, but I suspect a lot of those improvements will be in the context of their own ecosystem. So how can I make Google Workspace better if you're a user of Google Docs and you're a user of Google applications? Or how can I make Teams better if you're a user of Microsoft applications and so forth? And so the fact that we can really be sort of cross-platform and support a wide range of different sort of data sources from consumer to business applications across different platforms puts us in a unique position.
Okay, my last question here. What are some challenges that you face as a founder, an experienced founder, that keep you up at night?
I think as a startup, there's many phases in a company. In the beginning, sometimes you start with ideation. You kind of want to swim in the right direction, and then there's like sort of the next step. It's like building out the prototype, building the early team. Then it's sort of getting to product market fit and funding and growing and scaling. And so, I always am thinking about like, okay, are you at product market fit? You could be at 100 active teams, but maybe nobody's paying, or maybe you have 5 teams paying, but you don't feel like you have 50 teams paying. And the definition of product market fit is always evolving, and it's changing. It's not like it was before. There's a lot of these sort of idioms that people say, sort of, if you have 10 paying teams, you can get to 100 paying teams and so forth. But that's something I always think about, like that sort of changing definition, evolving definition, because you do want to get to a point where you feel like that the product in market is at a point where it's just all about scaling now. Like you have a rinse and repeatable model. Now let's figure out how to go from 100 teams to 1 million teams, or whatever it might be. And I'm just talking about one sort of challenge. Obviously, there's different challenges even in growing your team and getting to a point where you feel like you have enough redundancy in your team that they can operate if somebody wants to take a vacation, things like that. So there's ranges of different things that I think about. I don't want to say it's any one thing, but I think these are all normal things within the bounds of growing and running a startup.
Certainly, yeah. Awesome. Well, thank you for sharing. Before we get out of here, what's the best way for our listeners to reach you and Pulse and learn more about Pulse, that is?
To reach me, I'm just at raj@getpulse.team or at mobileraj on Twitter, but I'm not as active on Twitter as I should be. And if you want to learn more about Pulse, just visit Pulse, which is at www.getpulse.team.
All right, Raj, thank you. We're going to end the podcast there. If you liked our show, please subscribe wherever you listen to podcasts, and please leave us a rating. Raj, thank you for joining the show. We appreciate your time and your insights.
Thank you.